really happy to have with us folks who it looks like probably will have some really keen memories of living through the worst of the HIV/AIDS crisis, whether as a Dignity member or not, as well as some folks for whom resources like Michael's book are really helping to shape the experience, their sense of what that experience was like. So really glad to have everybody with us tonight. Again, we're going to ask everybody to, we're going to keep everybody muted other than the speakers for the first little more than a half hour. And we encourage you to shift over to speaker view for that section if you'd like to, and then to come back to gallery view for the rest of the session once we get into the conversation. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker and facilitator for this evening. I think many Dignity members are already familiar with Michael Laughlin's journalistic work at publications ranging from the National Catholic Reporter, Crux in America, to the Boston Globe and the Advocate. He has long written about a particular interest of Dignity's, the intersection of religion and the public square, often with a focus on Catholicism. His current book that we're here to discuss tonight is based on his podcast, Plague, Untold Stories of AIDS and the Catholic Church. Mike is currently the national correspondent for America Media, and we're really glad to have you with us tonight, Michael. And Tom Orians, who will be facilitating tonight's conversation with Mike, has a long history of service with Dignity USA and with several of our chapters. Tom has a master's in theology from Washington Theological Union, where his thesis focused on ministry with the LGBTQ community. And most relevant for tonight's conversation, Tom was an early activist and minister within and beyond Dignity on HIV/AIDS ministry, working with such groups as the AIDS Interfaith Network, the Council of Religious AIDS Networks, and the National Catholic AIDS Network, where he served as our representative for many, many years. So Tom and Mike, we welcome you both. Thank you for being here on behalf of Dignity USA, and I'm very excited to have you get this important conversation underway.
Well, let's get started. Michael, I just want to say I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation as well, to gather some more from your insight. And I'd like to start tonight with a two-part question. Why this book, and why now? Years after the pandemic had happened. Why this book and why now?
Sure. Thank you, Father Tom, for agreeing to facilitate the conversation. We had a conversation kind of getting ready for this event, and I was learning so much from you, and you had mentioned you know so many people who I write about in the book, so it's really an honor to have you spend time with us tonight, and I look forward to you sharing some of your own insights as well. And thanks for everyone for kind of joining this event and being part of this evening. When I was writing, there was so much information from members of Dignity all around the country. Many people were generous with their time to tell me their stories. I was able to go into some archives and learn a lot about Dignity through those papers and old recordings that I was able to find. And then just being familiar with Dignity, I was able to join you for part of your national conference in Chicago. I know time's all messed up. I think it was a few years ago now, but it was a good experience where I got to chat with a lot of members and hear some of those stories. So when I began planning where I would talk about Hidden Mercy, Dignity was high on my list. So I was grateful that Marianne was able to put something together and for the good attendance here tonight. So thank you. So to answer your question, why this book and why now? Marianne mentioned that I am a journalist who covers the Catholic Church. And for the last 10 years or so, I had been writing a lot about LGBT issues. And some of it was simply because that's what's been in the news a lot the last 10 years. When I started writing in 2012, 2013, the debate about same-sex marriage was really heating up around the country. There was a lot of push to legalize it in states that hadn't legalized it yet. And there was a suspicion that the federal government may get involved at some point. And part of my job was to cover how were Catholics responding to these debates. That meant covering things like bishop statements, looking at LGBT groups. I'm sure I wrote a fair bit about statements from Dignity, other LGBT Catholic organizations. And I was able to cover a lot of those topics. But at the same time, as a gay Catholic myself, it was simply something I was interested in. I was kind of grappling with what does it mean to be a member of the LGBT community and a Catholic who is committed to one's faith. And I felt like I didn't really know the history about this topic. To me, it all felt very new. Like I was kind of walking down this path on my own for the first time, and I didn't know where to turn. I didn't know about available resources. And I was kind of afraid that if I kept reporting on these topics, people might begin to suspect that I had a kind of personal stake in it. I was out to friends and family, but not publicly. And it was very nerve-wracking when I would write about these topics. And I was telling a priest friend this one night over dinner, I write about this in the book, where I kind of felt isolated and alone, and I wasn't sure where to go for advice. I suspected he would be a sympathetic ear. And sure enough, he told me that he understood. And he told me a story about when he had been a young priest in the early 90s. He was working on a Catholic college campus, and he began to hear that some students and faculty were affected by the HIV and AIDS crisis, whether personally or they knew others who were living with HIV or suffering from AIDS-related complications, and they felt like they didn't have anywhere to turn. So he offered the Catholic Student Center on campus as a place to meet and form a support group. And it really became a thriving ministry on the campus. And the bishop heard about this and called my friend in, who was prepared for the worst. And the bishop did ask him to shut it down because he felt like offering this ministry was sort of supporting the gay agenda, whatever that means. And my friend said no, that this was an organization providing comfort and solace. I think he actually told the bishop, using his own language, that it was a pro-life group and he wouldn't shut it down. And the bishop relented. And I was really struck by that story because I hadn't known this about my friend, even though I had known him for a number of years at this point. And he suggested that there were many, many more stories like this out there that might provide an opportunity for me to learn some of this history, to see that there were others kind of forging this path before me. And I did what I do, and I started researching, sitting in archives, emailing, calling, asking people who lived and worked through this time about their experiences, and was just amazed at how often I was told by people I interviewed that they hadn't really been asked about this time in history. People had kind of moved on over the last few decades, and they were eager to share it. And the second part of your question, why now? Well, part of it's selfish, right? Like I was on this search and I just happened to have this conversation, so I started it. But as I got more into the research, a couple of things happened. First, I realized how many people had passed away, whether from AIDS-related complications at the time or were 30 years out, 40 years out from the height of the epidemic. If you were engaged in HIV and AIDS ministry, perhaps you just hadn't been able to tell your story before you passed away. And secondly, as I was interviewing people, this happened more than once where I would interview someone and they would give me the names of other people who simply were no longer around. Or in one instance, I was able to interview a surgeon at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York, and just weeks later, he passed away. Ours was the last interview we ever gave, and it was the only time his story about this particular time was captured. So it was really a wake-up call to me that if we're going to capture these stories, it has to be done now. So I was thankful to be able to get these stories out there in the book, and I really hope it's just the start of a conversation, because there's so many more that could be included.
Yeah. And that leads me kind of my next question, because I said, as I read the book, I saw that there was a continuing theme throughout the whole book, and that's the notion of the importance of story. And I'd like to hear more about that, because I think the book is much more than a collection of stories. It's actually a collection of lived experiences that need to be shared by both men and women who walk together side by side with either living with the virus or caring for someone. So could you say a little bit more about the importance of story?
Yeah, this is a bit anachronistic, but something that Pope Francis has talked about often is that reality is greater than ideas. So this notion that if we encounter one another, that can help overcome abstractions that can sometimes in the Catholic Church be especially painful to LGBT people and their families and friends. So for me, that really came true during this research, where I didn't know much about this history to begin with. And by encountering people and listening deeply to their stories and experiences, I think I was able to be transported a little bit back in time. It was very difficult for me at first when reading about the crisis to understand what exactly was happening. I was born in the mid-'80s, so I don't remember much of that time firsthand. And I think if anyone listening tonight was able to check out the podcast Plague that preceded the book, you hear the stories from the individuals who lived through that time. And there's something about a man I interviewed named David Pace, who was a member of Dignity in New York, who lost his partner Bill to AIDS back in the 1980s. Hearing David tell that story offers this compelling journey really with him and his own faith experience. So there was something about being able to connect with people and simply ask, what was your experience back then, and invite them to take me back with them. And the generosity I encountered from nearly everyone I interviewed for the book was staggering.
Sure. Just a sidebar to this, talking about story. If you look at what Francis is doing with the church today, that whole notion of synodality is all about listening. It's about hearing the stories of others, and that being used from those stories to, as he probably would admit, comes to some kind of consensus of the reality of what church is about. So the story is extremely important, and it's a very good thing that the book came about as it did now, because those people are not around to tell their story and their experience. So the more we got it out, the better there is. There was something I kind of perceived in going through the book as well, and that was an air of secrecy about people who were associated with AIDS ministry throughout the time. In some ways, in my own association, I often heard people say to me, well, I can't tell anyone about my work with AIDS or my work with AIDS patients. I heard that over and over again in my 20-some years of direct contact with people. And I have to wonder whether some of that was a fear as well, that because of that work, I might be, someone just might make the assumption that I'm gay, whether it was true or not. Did you find that was a reality as you began to hear stories?
I did. It came up all the time, especially I'll say with priests and sisters and brothers, religious brothers who were involved in this ministry. Many of the lay people I interviewed were already part of groups like Dignity. They were openly LGBT and involved in HIV and AIDS ministry. But I think for priests and sisters especially, there was this sense that anyone involved in HIV and AIDS care, especially early on, was either LGBT themselves or an ally, and that it might invite too much suspicion. And Father William Hart McNichols, who helped out with Dignity chapters in Denver and then New York, sort of an early pioneer in HIV and AIDS care, he told me explicitly that was a fear he had, that he had helped out with Dignity, but he could kind of be under the radar with that. He was a young priest, and he reminded me this was long before social media, so there was like not the same sense of fear there might be today. But he said when he was asked to begin helping out with HIV and AIDS care in New York, the first invitation was to celebrate a mass. He actually hesitated a little bit because he had been bullied growing up. People had assumed that he was gay, and he was bullied growing up. And he, while comfortable telling some friends, I'm not sure about family at that point, but he just wasn't sure if he was ready to be publicly known as a gay priest. But ultimately, through a lot of prayer and reflection about what he owed his community, what he was being called to do in terms of ministry, he decided that he had to do that no matter what his fears were. And he said at that point, most people he met who were involved with HIV and AIDS care were part of the LGBT community. And he said rumors started to pop up about him, and he simply didn't refute them because there was no point in it. So there was this fear. And as a result, I think a lot of secrecy and even some shame in terms of people who were volunteering in this ministry.
Which is probably why some of the stories never got told either. I shared with this when we had our conversation earlier, but I'll share it now. I worked at St. Clair's in New York when I was very, very early on in the ministry. And I was at work one day and I met this woman who I thought was very familiar. And it turned out that she was in my religious community. And we started talking, and she told me, "Oh no, you can't tell anybody that I'm doing this. They're not supposed to know that I'm doing this because, you know, they'll be afraid of me. They won't come and talk to me and stuff like that." So that was a very lived, real experience. Again, as you said, in most cases, it was with religious that they had that kind of experience, but there were plenty of other people who had that experience too, that were just afraid to tell, you know, people what they were doing. Which kind of leads me to the next question I had, which was, do you think in some lives this was an internalized homophobia, where they actually were afraid of somebody labeling them, or afraid of their own fears in their own lives?
I suspect there was some of that. I mean, I certainly get the sense still that there's some of that. But at the same time, I think especially for the priests and sisters who were involved with the ministry, there was also a real risk of professional repercussions, especially members of religious communities who could be reassigned, who could be told not to engage in that ministry, who could face punishment. And ultimately, I think a lot of religious communities did some really good work. Some of it was behind the scenes, like you said, but I think there was some internalized homophobia. I see someone posted in the chat about priests who were diagnosed with HIV, many of whom died from AIDS in the 80s and 90s. So there was a lot of, I think, complicated psychology happening at the time. But I'm glad that in the book, I was able to recount some of the stories of people who overcame those fears and biases and were able to step up and do the right thing.
Yeah, there is and it's in your book briefly, I think, mentioned the episode of the auxiliary bishop of New York and his passing, and how that was covered up, or deliberately covered up, basically. And then years later, I believe that the death certificate did get changed. But just that whole terrible fear. What if one of the hierarchy, you know, and that was truth. There was no doubt about it. The circle of New York kind of knew that that was the truth, but it certainly got covered up. And I think that was a tremendous fear, because we can't be associated. We can't have one of ours associated. And that was a very tough thing to deal with. And I suspect in many ways it was a horrible experience for him. Because he probably felt very alone and isolated because they just didn't want to deal with it. And I didn't know him personally. I knew several people who did know him, and he was very much open about his life and the way he lived his life. But again, no one was able to really capture his story, which is why this book is so important, because you did capture stories, but no one ever captured his real story. And I'm sure there's you know, thousands of those people out there who had very real stories to tell, but there was no one to listen, or a very small circle to listen. Over the years, I think many good ministries have gone the wayside now because of budget cuts, or the false, even worse, the false perception that HIV/AIDS has been cured. So there's no need to have any ministry, any kind of an outreach to people living with HIV/AIDS today. What do you think about that?
Yeah,
is there still a future for HIV/AIDS ministry in the years ahead?
That's something I close the book with. I talk about a number of ministries in the book. Some were started by Catholic lay people, others by priests and sisters, and they did incredible work, some of them for 10, 20 years. One of the main ministries I profile is an organization called Bethany Place, based in Belleville, Illinois. Sister Carol Baltasevich, who was a hospital sister of St. Francis, kind of covers a lot of ground in the book. Her story from encountering patients with HIV and AIDS early on as a young nurse, to moving to New York to learn about HIV and AIDS ministry, moving back home to Belleville and opening Bethany Place. That story was inspiring because it was someone who did overcome biases and set up an organization, became a leading advocate for people with HIV and AIDS in Illinois. And it was a bit unfortunate, though, because the story has a good ending where she leaves Bethany Place after about a decade, gets it set up to be a professionally run organization, and it keeps doing work for the community. But in the time between when I submitted the manuscript and before the book came out, Bethany Place actually closed. It was sort of a victim of both COVID and changing needs in the community. And in retrospect, it's a good example of how many of these organizations have struggled as HIV and AIDS became a more manageable condition. There was, I think, a lot of things that went into why the organizations didn't sustain themselves. But one thing I do find interesting, I would challenge Catholic organizations that have maybe stepped back from HIV and AIDS ministry to consider why. Early on, HIV and AIDS affected primarily gay men. It still does. It's certainly expanded into something that affects all society. But why has the church stepped back from this? There might be reasonable answers such as therapeutics, budgets, changing needs. Certainly more government funding was eventually available. But I think there still is an opportunity for Catholics to be engaged in this kind of work and this kind of ministry. So I hope that part of the conversation that comes from Hidden Mercy is a reflection on what we can still do today.
Yeah, I think you still need to build the awareness that it didn't go away. It isn't really cured. It may have become more silent because of the medications and stuff that have become available, but people are still living with it every single day. And we need to be there to journey with them, to know that, so that they know that there really is in our case, a caring Catholic community that is willing to walk with them and be there for them. And that's, I'm sure, a struggle for many, getting to understand that, but it hasn't gone away. I don't believe it's gone away at all, but it's certainly become more silent in some ways.
One of the kind of surprising or interesting things to me was in the book, I profile Most Holy Redeemer Parish in San Francisco, which had a robust HIV and AIDS ministry in the 80s and 90s. And it actually went away. The ministry kind of went away for a number of years, but just in the past few years, part of it has been resurrected as a support group for long-term survivors of HIV and sort of the unique challenges they're facing now, often without the networks they might have had because so many of their close friends passed away in the 80s and 90s. So there is this opportunity to serve people living with HIV who have been for decades. And then also, someone just pointed out in the chat there, tens of thousands of people in the United States are diagnosed with HIV annually. And of course, many, many more around the world. And the Catholic Church does a decent job responding to global HIV. But here in this country, I do think there's an opportunity to do more.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. Here where I live, we started very early on a support group called Do Not Fear to Hope. And it's still running today, and it still has a number of people that come to it. In fact, it's probably one of the longest running programs for support in New York State alone, and probably other states as well. But the need is still there. Especially, this is one of the things we have to face too, is the generation that experienced the pandemic the most are now aging considerably, and they're in their aging years. And their friends and their family and their support is gone. And they probably struggle. I can't speak for myself, but I'm sure there's a real struggle to try to find the support that they need to keep on going day to day, basically. And it may be the simplest things, but I think that's a great, tremendous thing that the church could offer. I don't know if it's willing to step up to that still or not, but it's something that I think is of value for the future. In the book, there seems to be a key word that also runs throughout the whole book, and at least I seem to see it. Maybe it's the eyes that I look through it. But the word that I seem to hear often was pilgrimage. And I think it was linked together with history. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good observation, and one I hadn't thought about too much, honestly, as I was giving talks and thinking about the book. But there is this idea of pilgrimage for me, being in the places that were heavily affected by HIV and AIDS, but then also in the Catholic spaces that responded so well. And I describe in the book one particular journey in New York, going from St. Francis Xavier Parish, where Dignity met before the Vatican letter, standing there looking at the iconography created by Father Bill McNichols, making my way down to Greenwich Village, past Stonewall Inn, and then over to the site of the former St. Vincent's Hospital, and just spending some time there and thinking about the incredible pain and sorrow that took place in those spaces, but also the signs of hope by the individuals who responded to provide the kind of pastoral care that people needed. A similar occurrence took place when I visited Most Holy Redeemer in San Francisco and met with the long-term HIV survivor group and listened to their stories and heard about their friends who had passed away. And you can kind of see people light up when they're going back to that time and thinking of the good memories too. There was one particular man I met named Thomas who told me that it was really awful for him as a Black gay man with HIV in the Catholic Church. He faced a lot of discrimination, but actually found a refuge at Most Holy Redeemer, and said that while there was a lot going on, being with other people who understood his experiences provided something of a refuge, and they actually had a lot of fun. That the support group wasn't maybe as heavy as it could have been at times, and provided something of an escape. So something about being in those places and making the trips and meeting with the people who understand that time, that was a particular blessing. And I was grateful that I was able to have the time and resources to meet so many people.
Yeah. In the book, you spoke of your interview with Sean Strub. Now, New Yorkers know him pretty well. I didn't meet him, but I knew a lot about him. And you mentioned that you asked yourself a very important question that to many of us that read the book, it's extremely important. You asked how much the church had lost by pushing people out like Sean. Pope Francis seems to be trying to listen to those that have been pushed out. Would you care to make any further comment about that?
Yeah, meeting Sean was a real blessing, because he's someone who was raised in a very Catholic household, someone who understands Catholicism very well, but also someone who felt like he had to join ACT UP to protest the church, because he saw in Catholic leaders an attempt to undermine public health campaigns. When his partner died from AIDS-related complications, he was very angry, because he thought if there had been better education, if there had been a cohesive public health message that wasn't undermined by politicians and religious leaders, maybe that wouldn't have happened. And getting him asking him questions that he was able to reflect on his faith, even though he had walked away, I thought was a helpful exercise in understanding what you said, what the church loses when it pushes people away. Because Sean is a successful activist, fundraiser, recently a politician. He was mayor of his small town. And I kind of lamented what the church might have lost. Like, what would he have contributed to the church on the LGBT issues, but all sorts of things if he hadn't been pushed away? Because it was interesting to me when I was interviewing him, there was still a sense that Catholicism was important to him. A quick anecdote from the book is that when we were on the phone, he was driving during the interview, and a fire truck went by and we could hear the siren, and then he was quiet for a second, and he explained that something ingrained in him was that when he hears a siren, he says a quick prayer. And there was something about Catholicism that spoke to him spiritually. And then he said that also drove his activism in a way, which was interesting. And I just couldn't help but think how many people from this time were pushed out of the church who did amazing work in all kinds of different fields, but from a secular point of view, even if they had been formed in the Catholic Church. And imagine what they could have done if they had felt welcome and empowered to stay.
Right. Yeah, it strikes me that my experience of the church became so myopic when we talked about HIV/AIDS. It became myopic in its lens. It kept focusing purely on sex acts versus then on recovery or helping. Classic example of that: the first AIDS czar for the United States was a very devout Catholic woman. She spoke at one of our conventions at one time. I happened to get her to do that. But her husband, who was also a Catholic, was the head of New York State prisons. And the question of should prisoners have condoms came up. Well, he was so close-minded. It could no. That you can't do that. The end result, of course, was the level of positivity in the prison population was huge in New York State. But it was all because of the definition or the vision of what a condom would be used for, which is crazy. But so much of that was dictated by the experience, people's experience of church, and they just couldn't break free of what they had learned. Mostly from childhood, what they had learned, and that's one of the things too that I think that for the survivors within the Dignity family and all across the board, the clear or new understanding of what faith meant, and it wasn't what they learned. They really had to struggle with issues, but it deepened their faith, and of course that reflects the shift that we've seen in the last 20 years from faith to spirituality, and I think that was very prevalent as well. The subtitle of the book is AIDS, Catholics, and the Untold Stories of Compassion in the Face of Fear. And as I read the book further, I began to wonder, is it not about our own journey and possibly your own journey of your understanding and your relationship as a gay man with the Catholic Church? Do you want to chat on that for a little bit?
Sure. Part of the book is definitely my own journey. I write in the book that it became clear to me pretty early on that I felt isolated and alone because I didn't know the history. And I write in the book, there was a person I interviewed in New York, a Catholic former journalist, Jim Deramo, who I interviewed because he and his husband Will had befriended Sister Carol during her visit to New York. And he was telling me a lot about the history around HIV and AIDS that I didn't know, especially around gay life in New York City at the time. And he remarked that without our history, we don't have an identity. And that kind of clicked with me, that in basically being a gay Catholic is a form of identity, right? That's ultimately what this is. And I didn't know much of this history, and that's why I struggled as a result. And part of that is because it's simply not taught in schools. Some of that's changing now, but when I was going through school, it wasn't taught. It's not passed on in families generally. Either it's avoided or it's just, why would this history be passed on, especially if parents don't know it. And then it definitely wasn't preached about in any positive way or taught in religious education when I was growing up. So I had this real gap in my historical understanding of both the church and our nation's history, and as a result felt really cut off from this time in history. So part of this search, of this journey, was reaching out and forming intergenerational friendships, just reaching out to people who were a few decades older than me and asking them about their own journeys. And what I found, and what I was able to put into the book, was there are a lot of different paths and avenues when it comes to making your faith life work as an LGBT Catholic, and different models I was able to include in the book, whether it's staying and fighting, whether it's joining a more affirming group like Dignity, or simply stepping away if it becomes too toxic for you. And all of these have their pros and cons. And ultimately, everyone I asked, how do you make this work? They said, well, you have to figure it out for yourself, but here's how it worked for me. So that discovery of different kinds of journeys was especially meaningful to me as I wrote the book.
After doing your interviews and writing the book, do you think that the Catholic Church really missed the boat when it came to responding to the AIDS epidemic and providing genuine pastoral care? A care which, of course, if we're at all familiar with the Gospels, we know it's a requirement of the Gospel. But do you think they missed the boat?
I don't know. I haven't had that question posed to me like that. Certainly in the book, I am able to highlight many, many examples of people doing the right thing. But at the same time, that's set up against the reality that the institutional church really failed, I think, to live up to the gospel in many ways, whether it was fighting against gay civil rights bills by bishops or undermining public health campaigns with organizations like the Catholic League. There was this general societal prejudice, obviously, shame and stigma attached to HIV and AIDS. And I think many Catholics did more to further that general sense of shame and stigma rather than fight it. At the same time, there are these many examples in the book of Catholics doing the right thing. And I know it's only a small number that I was able to include, and there's many more out there. So I think it's a mixed bag. I heard from a number of Catholics involved in HIV and AIDS scare who were also protesting the church, who said they do think that the church got a lot of things right, and that they're hoping Hidden Mercy and other projects like this can kind of maybe reset the scale a little bit, because there is this general sense, I think, that the church failed during this time. And I don't intend to sort of cover that up with this, but I do think that these stories are also part of the historical record.
Sure. Going back to the book and the fact of the stories, is there any one story that really has special meaning for you? Oh. I know I have my own from the book.
It's like picking a favorite child.
Yeah.
I've spent years now learning about these stories. I would say, I mean, if you read the book, if you have a chance to look at it, you will see that Father Bill, Sister Carol, and David Pace take up the kind of majority of the book, and I use their stories as an arc to tell other stories. So I think I know those stories best at this point, and they each offer different lessons for me in a different kind of history of this. But I'd be curious to hear what your favorite story was.
My favorite story is the story about Mary leading him home to God. You could probably tell it better than I can, but that's my favorite story.
Sure.
Because it makes it so real.
Yeah, this is actually an intersection between Father Bill McNichols and David Pace, two of the main characters in the book. And Father Bill had actually moved to New York. He was a young Jesuit priest then. He had moved to New York to study art. He was studying art at the Pratt Institute. And his goal was to become a religious artist. And he was having some early success. He was illustrating children's books, early studies of iconography. And that's when he was called into HIV and AIDS ministry. And I mentioned earlier about how he was hesitant to get involved because of his sexual orientation, but part of it too was simply he knew that if he got involved, he would be immersing himself totally in this, and he would have less time for his art. So he proved to be correct, and he kind of stepped away from his art a little bit, but not totally. And that's what I learned through the research, and we were talking about the prayer cards he created earlier. But one of the things he did in his HIV and AIDS ministry was host healing masses. And David Pace, who wasn't really connected to Father Bill, had heard about these masses. And David's partner, also named Bill, had been sick for a while. And when it became clear that the end was near, he left Bill at home and told him he was going to church and he would be back in an hour. He ends up at the healing mass that Father Bill is preaching, and is just a wreck during the mass, as you can imagine. Lots of complicated emotions. His partner's dying at home. And after mass, he approaches Father Bill, and he says, kind of on a whim, asked Father Bill if there was a message he could bring home to his partner as he lay dying. And Bill thought for a moment, and he said that because he has grown up in the Southwest in Denver, this tradition of lighting candles to mourn the dead came back to him. And he suggested that David tell Bill at home that Mary would be waiting with luminaria to guide him home, and that he had nothing to be afraid of, that the path would be well lit. And David went home and relayed this image to Bill, who then passed away hours later. And it was a powerful example of Bill's kind of artistic insight, creating this very powerful image for someone on the spot who decades later remembered it very emotionally. And one of the more powerful moments of writing the book was letting Father Bill know about this story he had never heard before, something that was so meaningful to David 30 years ago, connecting them and allowing them to share in that moment that they simply wouldn't have known about if the book hadn't been written.
Well, as Marianne has so quickly reminded us, we're running out of time here, but I just asked one final question, and that is there any advice that you would give to the LGBTQ Catholics today, either living with HIV, AIDS, or in general as a part of their pilgrimage of faith in the church today? What advice would you give?
Oh my gosh, I should be asking everyone on this call for advice, because I think you all have much more wisdom and insight than I do. And that's one of the dangers of these talks, is speaking to people who I know much more about this. So I do appreciate the invitation. I would say the one piece of advice that has stuck with me has been there's no one path forward. There's people who have told me they find a parish that's welcoming and they kind of ignore the rest. And to them, being Catholics means being a member of their particular community. Other people have said they simply ignore all the hateful comments that they hear from either the Vatican or bishops and focus on what spiritually their faith means to them. Others say they leave and come back and leave and come back. And it's a lifelong journey of figuring out when they can handle being Catholic. And I think there's nothing wrong with taking snippets of advice from all those different models and making it work. But the one thing I try to tell people, especially in my age cohort, maybe a little younger, is that once you decide you want to be part of this institution, you have to decide and know you're going to encounter some pain, some resistance. But really, your baptism is just as valid as any bishop or any pope. And really, you have the right to be in this church. So I hope that younger people, especially who don't always feel welcome, will make that decision to remain and then do what they can to make the church a more welcoming place.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to throw it back to Marianne at this point.
Well, you covered an awful lot of territory and ground, and I'm sitting here with a whole lot of reactions to all of this, but really, this is the time for folks who have joined the call to weigh in with questions, with comments, with something you'd like Michael to respond to. If you would like to speak, you are now able to do that. I would ask if you see the reactions button down in your toolbar, there's a raise hand feature there. If you click on that and you'd like to speak, we'll try and call on you. If you'd prefer to put something in the chat, we'll try and make that available to everybody. So is there anybody who has something they'd like to ask or share at this point? And I'd encourage folks to go back to gallery view if you haven't done so already, so that you can see folks. Carolyn S. has raised. Carolyn? Are you able to unmute, Carolyn?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Carolyn. I'm from Dignity, Indianapolis. And Michael, I just wanted to say that I listened to the entirety of your podcast and really enjoyed it. And I found myself tearing up a couple of times. That story that was told in the conversation about Mary welcoming the man home with luminaria, that was one in particular that got to me. Also the story of Father Michael Judge on 9/11, that was another one. So I just wanted to thank you for your great work. I found it very meaningful. And I also wanted to say that in this conversation, I didn't really think about the fact that you're preserving the stories of people who, have a limited amount of time to tell us those stories. The people that were alive during the peak of the AIDS crisis, we do need to gather their stories before they're gone. You said you were born in the mid 80s. I was born in the mid 70s. And so, I'm thinking about people who are maybe my parents' age and stuff like that. So anyway, thank you for your great work. Really enjoyed the podcast and look forward to the book.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for joining tonight. I'm actually just back from Indianapolis. I was meeting with students at Marian University earlier this week and kind of sharing some of the book with them and learning all about the challenges in Indianapolis the last few years. So I was grateful to see that there's, groups of LGBT people in their teens and 20s really fighting for change. And that's a good point. David's story about the luminaria is told, I believe, in the third or fourth episode of Plague, and hearing it from him and hearing Father Bill's reaction is incredibly powerful. So if people want to check that out, I'd encourage you to listen.
Great, thanks. We have a question in the chat from Dignity Washington, and then we'll go to Bill, and I think it's Marcia, whose hands I see up. Could you talk a little bit about your reaction to the book, specifically from the Pope and the Jesuits at America? Thank you, Washington folks.
Mike's been muted.
Oh. Can we unmute Mike, or can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Okay. Sorry, yeah, I unmuted myself and then couldn't unmute myself. No, thank you for asking that. Yeah, so certainly the reaction from the Pope was unexpected. Basically what happened was I had been working on these stories for years, and a common theme that kept coming up was people were telling me that there were Pope Francis Catholics decades before there was a Pope Francis. And that kept coming up. And I thought, I have all these stories. I want to share them with Pope Francis because I think he deserves to know about really incredibly powerful stories of Catholics who were doing the right thing when society told them not to do that, or it would have been easier to do nothing. So I sent him a letter telling him about Father Bill and Sister Carol and a copy of the book, and wanted to thank him for his comments affirming the LGBT community, let him know that there's many people in the United States thankful for them, and encourage him to keep doing so. And to my surprise, he wrote back, and I received a letter from him back in August. And in November, I revealed the contents of the letter in an op-ed I wrote for the New York Times. And basically, he wrote to thank me for writing the book, but also praised the people I wrote about in Hidden Mercy. He said that they undertook the work with with dignity and mercy and compassion, often at great risk to themselves. And one of the more powerful experiences in my journalist career has been being able to call Sister Carol, Father Bill, and David and read them the Pope's letter, because it was very difficult for them at the time to do this kind of work, and to be affirmed by the Pope 35 years later was a very powerful experience. In terms of the Jesuits, I know the Jesuits have a complicated history, especially with dignity. It was some Jesuit parishes that local chapters were kicked out of in the 80s. And at the same time, the Jesuits invested resources and gave me the time and space to do the Plague podcast. They've been incredibly supportive of the book. Obviously, my colleague, Father Jim Martin, has been out there doing LGBT ministry the last few years, has worked with the Pope to kind of advance this cause. So nothing but gratitude for the Jesuits, who have been totally supportive of this project.
Great. Thank you. Bill, let's turn to you, and then it was Brother Thomas. Sorry, Marcia, didn't mean to. I think Brother Thomas's hand showed up on your screen for a bit, but Bill, and then Brother Thomas.
Yeah, hi. Mike, I read the book. It brings me back into history. I was in Dignity, New York, with the AIDS ministry with Father Bernard Lynch. And I worked with Father Michael Judge for a number of years. I don't know if it was a depressing lift or inspiring, because little in a way has changed, even though the Pope Francis has moved us along. But in society, we've leapfrogged, into, it would never have happened, gay marriages, I don't know, to have reached where they got to in the 1990s, or what was it, 2000s. But for the church, the Catholic theology has such a way to go for us to understand what the Catholic identity is. And so I don't know if the church, if Catholic gays should be where they should really be in terms of their identity. Yes, but being in my 70s now, AIDS is almost like history. Even though the way you were talking with Tom, they should be there in the forefront of some kind of AIDS work. But there was, I guess, because there was such an intensity that I felt during the 1980s, being thrown out of Francis Xavier, working with so many different people, both as a volunteer and working in a position, and then also working later on. But it's almost like we need to go further in our understanding of what it is to be Catholic and gay, while at the same time, yes, AIDS is important, but for Catholicism to be understanding of the theology of the gay lifestyle is, for me, possibly the most important, maybe even the most important aspect of the work that needs to be done. Thank you.
Yeah,
Can I
thanks for sharing
respond?
that. Yeah,
Thank you for that. Can I just say something? I think that, yes, the whole Catholic identity issue is very important. And we're finally getting an opportunity to be heard. And that's, again, falls back in Francis's lap. The whole notion of synodality and what's happening in the next 2 years is very critical. And voices, I'm strong in this, voices cannot be silent on this matter. They need to be heard. So I think the best that any of us can do is to participate in any form somewhere, whether your diocese is doing it or not, other places are, to participate in that and let your voice and your story be heard. I think it's very important. And hopefully the church will grow from that.
But I think those who are older we have felt that it's been going on for 40 or 50 years.
Yeah.
You know? So I understand, but I think the Catholic, why the identity is so difficult for Catholic gay people is that the church is not moving enough.
Okay. I understand that.
Yeah. Mike, did you want to respond to that in any way, or?
No, thanks for sharing. You know, in the book, I do write about how I asked Father Bill McNichols if he thought it was better today, and he actually gave a kind of nuanced answer, like I think you would find interesting, just the sort of paradox of society advancing so far with LGBT issues, creating a backlash in the church and kind of the challenges that faces. So, no, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Brother Thomas, and then I see a hand from Mike Orr. Thomas, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
all
great.
Right. I haven't read the book yet because I don't have a copy of it, but I will order it now for sure. I've read a review of it in the National Catholic Reporter, and I'm so thrilled to be on this call with the author. I'm just elated by the work you're doing, Mike. And I'm one of the old guys, to be sure. I was way back in the founding of Dignity Detroit, and we're celebrating our 48th anniversary this year since our founding. And I was there at the very beginning with the Detroit chapter. And it was my generation, I'm 70 years old, it was my generation that bore the brunt of the AIDS epidemic back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, most of my colleagues contracted that, that plague, and many of them went home, permanently because of that. And I still miss many of them terribly. It's a loss that we never recover from. And the current loss that we're having in the Catholic Church, in particular with the LGBT community, is because of the hard stance the bishops are taking right now. There's a few exceptions, to be sure, but many of the bishops are so adamant against gay relationships right now, and they're firing people en masse who get legally married. They're actually telling people in one diocese in Michigan that they're no longer eligible to receive the sacraments. And they've also made that clear to anybody that supports them, including family members, that they too are not eligible to receive the sacraments. This is wrong. There's nothing right about it. And I imagine that some of this stuff is going on in other parts of the country too. Maybe not as publicly, but I'm sure it's going on in some other places. And then the other thing too is many of the bishops are promoting this discourage group, which is nothing but a 12-step program, and I can imagine what their 12th step is.
Yeah, thank you, Brother Thomas, for your own work in this, and your own ministry and witness. And you're right, I've been covering some of these topics, and I know there's a lot more out there. So yeah, just keep paying attention, keep bringing it up, because it's important that these issues are talked about for sure.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mike, could you?
Unmute, okay. Well, hello, Michael. I read the book as well, and I very, very much liked the book. I was very curious the moment I heard about it to read it, because I'm also from that age cohort where all this was coming right at us and slamming us in the face. And I did one time comment on a page somewhere, and I'll paraphrase what I said, because a page that you were on or speaking on, I'll paraphrase it for dignity because I'm not at an ACT UP meeting, but my comment at that time was, boy, it sure seemed like the church loved dying gays, but they didn't have much use for living, breathing, and kicking ones. The book, as much as I liked it and was impressed with many of the people, especially Father William and Sister Carol and some others, that still is in my head. That seemed to be their stance at the time, by and large. But my question is, there were the political issues that the bishops were engaging in and priests were engaging in, discouraging use of condoms, fighting gay marriage, even though that would allow people to get on their partner's health insurance. At this time, they were very ill. These seem to be absolutely immoral acts, absolutely immoral, that can't be papered over. With your kind of your exploring yourself, how did that weigh out to you when you also looked at these wonderful things that I think nuns do more often than priests, frankly? But yeah, how did that balance out for you?
Thanks, Mike. And I think that sentiment is exactly right, that there was this sense, sometimes I think you're right, even among the people who were doing really heroic work, that it was easier maybe to minister to someone dying rather than fight for their rights that might give them a chance at living. And there is that common criticism of these ministries that I do think should be grappled with a bit more, maybe perhaps a bit more than I was able to in the book. But I think you're right. There's something particularly, my word in the book, I think, was just cruel about the Vatican cracking down on groups of LGBT people who were turning to the church for spiritual solace during this time. Something particularly nasty about fighting gay civil rights bills when people really just wanted a place to live without fear of being kicked out, or a job where they could keep their insurance, even partner benefits where they would be able to keep their health insurance should one get sick. I mean, these were basic human rights that the church was fighting against. And I think there was a lot of complicated psychology probably with some bishops who were maybe personally part of the LGBT community, but not willing to disclose that while having to fight against these different measures around the country. There was also something particularly heinous, what we know now, where there were bishops who were moving around priests engaged in sexual abuse while playing the part of a moral crusader fighting against gay rights. I mean, this is all happening in the 1980s. And in the book, I give this example where two of the priests fighting most vocally against the use of condoms to fight HIV were Cardinal Bernard Law of Boston and Archbishop McCarrick of Newark. I mean, and what we know now is they're having press conferences about this. They were engaged in really heinous activity. So there's a lot there, and I'm getting a little bit riled up just thinking about it. And I devote some of the book to that topic, but I think historians especially will be able to explore this time and look at what exactly was happening then.
Yeah, absolutely. I think many of us probably would love to engage in this conversation many, many more hours. There's so much richness here, so many angles to approach. Mike, I just want to say, I think you have done a really important service by calling on people to go back and look at that time again and start digging out some of the messages from that perspective. I really want to thank Tom for all the work he put into, preparing for this conversation and helping us think about the many, many angles that are presented in this book, Hidden Mercy. And as I say, I have the original version pre the Francis endorsement on it. So if for folks who haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. I also just want to say that I think for those of us who were active in dignity communities at that time, we felt like, the frontline workers that are talked about today. I mean, we were the ones who were stepping in many ways when, churches were refusing to bury people, when moms and dads were learning their kid was gay and dying in a single conversation and had no place else to turn, when, weekend after weekend after weekend, our small little chapters were providing funerals for people because nobody else would do it. We're sponsoring those AIDS ministries. And so to hear some of the stories of other folks who were trying to do some of that work and, you know, against tremendous odds, but with amazing passion, commitment to the gospel and commitment to our lives was really wonderful. So thank you very much. I do want to let folks know that if, I have to go. Okay, okay, now I can't figure out how to advance this slide, Logan. What do I do?
Right arrow on your keyboard.
Thank you. Okay. So I just want to alert folks that for folks who would like to spread the word about this or participate again, our Dignity Twin Cities chapter is going to be hosting another conversation with Mike on February 20th at a local Catholic church in Minneapolis, as well as online. We will get that link out to folks if people would like that again. So, and with a few folks have spoken about the Synod. Tom gave us some great advertisements about how important that is. Dignity USA is launching a whole program we're calling Speak Your Truth to Our Church with Pride. You'll read about it in Friday's Dateline. But just to let you know that our next two online events are going to be related to the Synod. Dignity USA is among the many organizations that are hosting listening sessions. So they are coming up on Saturday, February 26th, 2:00 p.m. Eastern time, and adjust for your own situation. And then Thursday evening, March 24th. So we'll have two opportunities for people to come together, say what you'd like the full church to hear about issues of importance to LGBTQI people. And all of that will be compiled into a report that will be submitted to the Secretary General of the Synod in October. As always, we invite your support for the work that we do, whether it's these kinds of webinars or advocacy to raise awareness of these awful kinds of policies that continue to come from the bishops, or just being there for people who are coming out as queer and Catholic and who need a chance to know what's out there that will affirm them. So please, there's a link there that if you are able to, we really welcome your financial support. Thank you again to everybody for being here tonight. Again, special thanks to Tom and Mike for a really challenging conversation. And thanks as always to Logan for doing a magnificent job with the tech.